Good morning and welcome to a special edition of Worldview with Trudy Rubin. Today, we're doing things a little bit differently. Trudy, who is normally the host of this show, is the Inquirer's International Affairs columnist, which makes her our guest today instead of our interviewer. That's because her expertise makes her the perfect person to unpack the issues and answer your questions about what's currently happening in Afghanistan as U.S. troops exit and the Taliban takes over. So today, I'm pitching in to help guide the conversation. My name is Erica Palan, and I'm the Deputy Opinion Editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. At any time during the discussion, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions for Trudy. To do so, please ask your questions in the comment section at the bottom of this page. If you're watching from social media, please visit inquirer.com/TrudyLive to submit your questions. I'm going to say that URL again, inquirer.com/TrudyLive. Now, before we get started, I'd like to take a few minutes to sing the praises of my colleague, Trudy Rubin. Regular viewers of Worldview know that she needs very little introduction. She's the author of the twice-weekly Worldview column for the Inquirer's opinion section, which she's been writing since 1983. A two-time Pulitzer finalist, Trudy has been writing about the Middle East for decades and has visited Afghanistan and Pakistan many times. She's literally walked the streets where today's news is happening. Welcome, Trudy.
Very good to be here, Erica, even though the subject is very sad.
Yes, truly. So before we dive into the politics and the implications of this week's news, I want to sort of lean on your expertise to set the table and give our readers just a small history lesson so that all viewers understand exactly what we're talking about when we get into other parts of this discussion. So I'm going to start very simply. I think we all have a sense that the Taliban is a religious movement and a military organization. Many people see them as a terrorist organization. But can you tell us a little bit about who they are and how they came to power?
To understand who and what the Taliban are, you really have to go back to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and their exit at the end of '89. The Soviets, when they came in, when they napalmed and bombed, caused a huge outflux of refugees into Pakistan who settled in refugee camps. And in those times, those camps produced a whole generation of young men. Many of them went to religious schools in Pakistan that was set up with the help of Saudi funding. And those schools taught a very austere and harsh version of Islam, which was contrary to the historic trend of Sunni Islam in Afghanistan, which was more spiritual. After the Soviets left, there was a civil war in Afghanistan between militias that we had funded via the Saudis, many of them Islamist. And as they fought each other, they caused chaos in the country, and villagers and ordinary people just didn't know what to do. Then came the Taliban in '94. A Talib is a student. Many of the Talibs came out of these religious schools, and they formed a movement which allegedly started in the south of Afghanistan in Kandahar, near the Pakistani border. The country sort of gave into them because it wanted peace. People wanted peace and stability. People who are longtime students of Afghanistan, including Pakistani scholars like Ahmed Rashid, say that the movement was actually created by the Pakistani intelligence agency known as the ISI. The Pakistanis, in internal war with India, saw the Taliban as a group that they could control and therefore keep their archenemy India from having extensive influence inside Afghanistan. So you had this movement of students, very primitive, taking over a country that they had no idea how to rule, believing in this extremist variant of Islam that was contrary to Afghanistan modes and culture. but people simply wanted security. What they got was something that most Afghans really did not want. Now, you have to fast forward, and I think we're going into the history a little bit later of how the Taliban fell and why they came back again. But basically, they were an outgrowth of the chaos after the Soviet invasion and the Soviet withdrawal.
Thank you for that, Trudy. I'm thinking correct me if I'm wrong, you were in Kabul in 1999 for several weeks while the Taliban was in power. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like?
Sure. It was surreal. You could see that these young men had no idea about a modern society or how to run a country. I went into the foreign ministry and they were sitting on the floor drinking tea. The foreign ministry had been gutted. Most of the Talibs couldn't speak English. The only women you saw on the street were shrouded in blue burqas with only mesh for their eyes to peek out and begging with their hand under this tent-like garment. And the reason so many were begging was because there were so many Afghan war widows, and women were not allowed to work. They were not allowed even to go out of the house without a male guardian. It could be their 16-year-old son if they had one, but many of these women had young children. They were starving, and sometimes the Taliban would come and beat these women who were just sitting under shrouds in the street trying to get money to feed their children. There was only one hospital in Kabul that would take women because it was all women doctors and nurses. When I went into the hospital, they were afraid to speak to me. Girls could not go to school. When I interviewed the then Deputy Minister of Education, who is now one of the leading Taliban figures, he told me, oh, the situation is too tenuous for girls to go to school, but sooner or later we'll let them go to religious school. And from what I understand from women, especially one woman I know who's been in the government negotiating team with the Taliban, negotiations that never went anywhere and are now virtually actually dead. The Taliban, despite public proclamations to the contrary, still have the same primitive attitudes towards women that they had then. They may have to handle it somewhat differently because there are so many educated women now, and they may need some of those skills, but the attitude is the same. Women should not go out. Women should not have jobs in the bureaucracy. Women are already being fired from the bureaucracy in places where the Taliban is in control. They're being fired from TV. You have contradictions now. The national Taliban says they will let women work, but at the local level, Taliban are behaving the same.
You know, I'm struck listening to you talk, Trudy, about the fact that you were a woman and you were reporting there. And I wonder, can you talk a little bit about the challenges of reporting in a country that's so has such harsh punishments for women who are doing far less than you were doing? I'm curious, what do you wear? How do you approach people?
It was extremely difficult because there were very few foreign correspondents in Kabul at that time. I want to pay tribute to the courage of little girls because I actually snuck behind, and I was more frightened for them than for me. But some little girls who were actually sneaking in one by one to a secret girls' school. And I went in there, the courage of a teacher who would meet with these girls and these little girls who would try to get to learn to read was breathtaking. And the idea of it happening again was a horror. I was instructed at the time not to go outside my car, even in a burqa. I was covered supposedly as a foreign woman. I could be there if I was heavily covered, and I was heavily covered, with a shawl around everything but my face, with very loose clothes, a cloak over everything. But I was told that if I went on the street, that would not prevent me from being beaten by Talibs who went around with rubber hose to attack any woman they saw on the street. They might ask questions afterwards. So it was frustrating. I mean, I would get out of the car and I would sneak into houses, just looking to see that there was nobody on the street. I also went to a women's feeding center where all of these widows were lined up desperate for a bowl of food that they could take home to their children. And the women doling out the food were PhDs and former professors. One of them told me, "I'm so grateful to get out of the house for a few minutes every day." So I could get into that space because it was women only. So Taliban wouldn't come into it. It was under UN control. So they allowed the feeding space. But for the most part, it was sneaking around.
Wow. So one last sort of history question to set the table. I think most people know that the United States went to Afghanistan shortly after the 9/11 terror attacks. And we are, of course, coming up on the 20th anniversary of those in a few weeks. Obviously, whole books have been written about this because it's big and complicated and messy. But can you briefly walk us through how did the United States become entangled in Afghanistan?
Well, of course, again, we were entangled from the time of Ronald Reagan when we allowed the Saudi or encouraged the Saudis to fund these religious militias that were fighting the Soviets, and we gave them Stinger missiles to shoot down Soviet helicopters. We did not support Afghan nationalist groups who were traditionally religious. Just as we did in Syria, we handed off to the Saudis who supported the really religious groups, not the Taliban, but some groups that later affiliated with the Taliban and with Al-Qaeda. So fast forward, after 9/11, the United States launched a war to get rid of the Taliban because the Taliban refused to give up Al-Qaeda. They refused to give up bin Laden. We did not fight on the ground. The people who fought on the ground were militias in northern Afghanistan. They were other ethnic groups, not Pashtuns like the Taliban. And at that time, they fought fiercely, and we provided the air support. But as people of a certain age will remember, the Taliban escaped because we didn't follow them up on Tora Bora, and they went into Pakistan. So in the initial years after 9/11, the Bush administration changed its focus to Iraq and basically paid very little attention to Afghanistan. And after the Iraq invasion, suddenly they began to notice that between 94 and 96, the Taliban made a comeback. They made a comeback because of Pakistani support. The Taliban had taken refuge in Pakistan. Pakistan funded them, trained them, armed them, and they came back into the country. And in the chaos, as I said, they were able to take over. The Taliban, after 2001, we started paying attention when there was this period that it looked like the Taliban might take over the country again. So slowly, we were putting more troops in. And in December 2009, President Obama, was convinced by the military to surge troops to try to clamp down on the Taliban. But he put an 18-month limit on it. And then after May of 2011, Osama bin Laden was killed, and we drew down troops. Under Trump, there was a stalemate and an attempt to negotiate with the Taliban. In February of 2020, President Trump basically signed a surrender document with the Taliban, sort of giving them everything, giving the Afghan government nothing. They didn't even take part. And the Taliban started violating it from the get-go. And that brings us, and the numbers of US troops kept being drawn down. April 2021, Biden declares the war will end by 9/11 at the latest, and the Taliban renege on the peace negotiations, which they never seriously took part in, and the rest you've seen in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah. We're going to get into Biden and his role in this in just a few minutes. But before we do that, one of the things that I really have appreciated about your columns on this topic, and I'll note here that, yeah, Trudy, you've been writing about this particular fear since about March of this year, long before others, I think, were writing about it. But one of the things I've really appreciated is that your concern has always been for the personal impacts that politics have on human life. And I know you've spent the week plus talking to Afghans, particularly women who want to get out but can't. Can you give me a sense of what it's like to be on the ground there right now?
It is so painful to be in touch with wonderful people who suddenly have had their life crumble around their ears. I know a lot of educated Afghans, and nobody really expected the US to leave totally. There were only 2,500 troops there. We may get into this later, but I thought that was an insurance policy that we could afford to keep. There had been no US casualties for months. Actually, I think for a couple of years, we were not in combat. The Afghans were doing the fighting. And I think that Biden's announcement and then the speed of the withdrawal, which was basically completed by July 4th, just stunned people. And a lot of intellectuals whose names are on Taliban lists and women, they just hadn't made plans to get out. So there is a desperation. I and many friends of mine who have been in the country are getting emails every day, help us, help us, help us. And there is also this horror because a lot of young Afghans of the current generation in their 20s and 30s, they either didn't know the Taliban or they never lived under the Taliban. And now they're facing the end of everything they believed in. Let me tell you about one email I got from a woman who has a green card, but is still in Kabul trying to get her locally based family out. She says, after 20 years of constant and effortless work, she worked as the chief of mission for an NGO that was helping carpet manufacturers export their wares to the US, funded by USAID. After 20 years, I'm standing where my mother used to say, as the new game of survival just began. Her mother, 20 years ago, had to take the children and run for refuge in Pakistan because the Taliban was coming. And now the same thing is happening to her. It will burn the city we built. But of course, it won't harm the corrupt ones. They always know when the disaster is starting. It took me 20 years devoting myself to Afghanistan and nurturing the dream to see it die. This woman went to the airport trying to get out and was beaten with rifle butts. I still don't know if it was by US soldiers or it wasn't by Taliban. She says she had to get through Taliban checkpoints. Now she's afraid to go back, and she doesn't know how to get her family out because they don't have green cards. I am hearing from girls' school heads, from teachers, from women politicians, from women journalists, and all of them know that their names are on the lists. And they can only get out if they have high-level connections. And if the US leaves on August 31st, their chances are next to nil.
It's heartbreaking to hear those stories. You've talked a lot about women right now, but I know the other group that you're passionate about saving is translators. And I heard an interesting piece on NPR, I think NPR, over the weekend, where they spoke to an Afghan translator who just sort of feels abandoned by the US. And I wonder, can you speak a bit about that as well?
Absolutely. I've been writing on translators since 2008 when Congress passed legislation to give special immigrant visas known as SIVs to Afghan translators and Iraqi translators. For the first several years, it was almost totally focused on Iraqis. And I still have Iraqis who have never gotten their SIVs, and the program for them is ended. The brother of my translator, one brother was killed in revenge for my translator working for the American military and for me. And another brother has lived in hiding all these years. Fast forward, under President Trump, the SIV program for Afghan translators was practically killed. But there should have been more done under President Obama also, but it was practically dead under President Trump because it was seen as immigration from Muslim countries. Fast forward to this year, many people working on this issue who feel passionately about it, military officers, U.S., who care deeply about their translators, Congress people who have worked tirelessly on this. Seth Moulton of Boston, a lot of U.S. Military who are now in Congress have been begging for progress on this for months. The problem was there wasn't a focus on it. They should have been evacuated en masse from Bagram Air Base. There are 18,000 who have started the process, plus their families, about 70,000 people. Military has been saying for months they will not be able to get out unless there's a mass evacuation. We did a mass evacuation in Vietnam before we finally left of 120,000 people. Why didn't Biden do a mass evacuation? They were asked not to by President Ashraf Ghani, who then fled the country in a cowardly fashion. Because it would look bad, it would cause a panic. But the big mistake was the Biden team didn't understand how fast the country and the military would crumble. So they thought they had plenty of time, that this wasn't urgent. And yet military people were telling them, once you leave Bagram, you can't do an evacuation. I wrote this. It was not a secret. If you try to get people out through a civilian airport, thousands of Afghans will rush there, and you won't be able to get the evacuation going. So this was the greatest fear of people who supported getting the translators out. And this is why groups supporting them still, including many veterans, are so deeply upset and are still calling for President Biden to extend the August 31st date and negotiate that with the Taliban so that more translators can get out, which they will not do if we keep to that date.
So one of the things you just mentioned was that Biden thought he had more time before the city and the country crumbled. And I do wonder, why did Kabul and the country fall so quickly? Why did that happen sooner than Biden predicted?
You know, I think I'd sum it up under three headings: psychology, corruption, and Pakistan. Psychology, I have talked to some of the best historians and experts on Afghanistan, and they've repeatedly said the same thing. When Biden announced this final pullout, it was a psychological blow because Afghans who have suffered under so many regimes and foreigners in the past decades just assumed the game was up, that the fix was in, that it was no use fighting anymore because the U.S. was pulling out and just leaving them and handing them over to the Taliban. That was the perception, because the deal that President Trump had done basically did that. The Afghan government wasn't even included. Then there was corruption, U.S. money pouring in, and there never, sadly, was a strong Afghan government at the top. There's lots of explanations for that. I won't go into it here because it could take the whole rest of the time. People can ask questions. But the Afghan grunts, Afghan soldiers who have taken 65,000 casualties in the last few years, and even their special forces who have fought bravely but have been decimated, they looked up and they thought, who are we fighting to the death for? The Americans are gone, and American air support was crucial. American maintenance of Afghan Air Force planes was crucial because we set them up with a military that was too much like ours. They couldn't do the technology. With that gone, and with a corrupt government in Kabul, people didn't know who they were fighting for anymore. And the Taliban cleverly went to village chiefs, went to even some of the warlords who had fought against them back in the war that we led after 9/11, and said to them, the game is up. Make your deal with us now, or we're going to kill you and your families. And many of these village chiefs, police chiefs, and even warlords decided the game was up. And then there's Pakistan. I've already talked to people who believe that this whole movement since Biden's announcement was engineered by Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI. The Taliban were organized. They had weapons. They had new uniforms. They have a safe haven in Pakistan where the ISI trains them and equips them. And many think that just as in 96, when they took over, the ISI had a game plan because it wanted the Taliban to win so that India couldn't make inroads in Afghanistan. And so that we don't know the truth of, but it has the ring of truth to me. So, again, psychology, the game is up. Why should we fight for these corrupt leaders in Kabul, and corrupt leaders who had sent out governors to the provinces who were also corrupt? And finally, and a major, major factor, Pakistan.
Thank you for that. I do want to remind our readers that you can submit questions for Trudy at inquirer.com/TrudyLive. And I was going to hold reader questions till the very end, but I want to ask one right now because I think it's very relevant to what you were just talking about. And so one reader asks, did Biden have any way out of the Trump agreement with the Taliban, or it was sort of a fait accompli for him?
Absolutely, he had a way out. President Biden has been willing to reverse other things that President Trump had done. This was simply an excuse. The deal that ex-President Trump made with the Taliban forced the Afghan government to release 5,000 hardened Taliban prisoners, many of whom are leading the fight today. It only required a Taliban promise not to support al-Qaeda any longer. But there's been numerous reports of al-Qaeda groups fighting with the Taliban today. And it didn't require a ceasefire. So the Taliban kept fighting all this time since this agreement with Trump. So it was totally violated. There was no requirement to keep the deal.
I think I've been thinking a lot about the columns that you wrote prior to the 2020 election. And one of the things that you felt positively about with President Biden was that he did have foreign policy experience where some of the other candidates did not. And I wonder, knowing that was true, that Biden did have more foreign policy experience, how did he get this so wrong?
I think one has to be fair, and I've been tremendously critical of him. Biden came into office facing a mess on many fronts. Primary was trying to get the vaccination program for COVID up and running, which was huge, and where he had been left with no clear national program to just help distribute at the local level. He then very much wanted to turn attention to China and Russia, no longer to give President Putin a pass on everything, and trying to create a strategy against a harder line on China. And he felt that it was necessary to end what he considered to be forever wars and move towards a clean slate. He also wanted to tighten relations with our allies. I think where the problem emerged is that President Biden has wanted to get out of Afghanistan for a long time. He opposed the surge under President Obama, and he lost on that one. And I think he came to office thinking, I'm just going to keep, the Trump cover story, the agreement, and I'm just going to end this because it's not going to end any differently later. I think he made a terrible mistake on two fronts. You will find Republicans arguing end the forever war. Republicans supported Trump's peace accord with the Taliban. But the mistake was this. It was a narrative, staying in Afghanistan with 2,500 troops, and then there would have been over 7,000 NATO troops and contractors, was an insurance policy. Those 2,500 were not fighting anymore. They were simply providing morale. It was not for victory. It was to keep the Taliban from taking over. Just like we keep 25,000 troops in South Korea to keep North Korea from having ideas of invading the South. So he didn't look at it as an insurance policy. He looked at it as a forever war. That was mistake number one. And mistake number two was, for some reason, totally underestimating the speed with which the Afghan military would collapse. I was being told that it would collapse by experts here on the Afghan military at the beginning of August. A little over a week into August, the North fell to the Taliban. This was a signal. The North had been the bastion of fighting against the Taliban when the Americans fought the Taliban in 2001. How all these signals were missed, I don't know. And the third mistake is, apparently, the administration thought they had oodles of time to get translators and endangered Afghans out. That's a subsection of mispredicting the speed of the fall. But they had to keep Bagram Air Base in order to do it. They gave up Bagram Air Base before they had even gotten Americans out because they didn't expect that this was going to have to be a speedy departure. But if they wanted to get out the translators and Americans, they should have started a departure process long before they gave up Bagram Air Base, and they shouldn't have listened to President Ghani because clearly the end was in sight. And once they gave up Bagram, the evacuation prospects were nearly nil.
So I'm thinking a lot about how this situation, this moment that we're in, it's not the first time that America has been careless when it comes to leaving countries. Of course, we have Iraq and Syria and Vietnam. It's hard not to draw the comparisons when you see the photos of Afghans at the airport with the photos, the famous photos from Vietnam of people trying to get on the helicopters. You cited all of this in a recent column. And do you believe that America's exit from Afghanistan is going to go down in history as just another botched effort? Or is there anything Biden can do right now to sort of turn the tide and make this not another black mark on our history?
I think it will be another black mark. I think the carelessness of American evacuations it is just becoming so upfront that it becomes a message to allies around the world, both in developing countries and our NATO allies as well. When we left Vietnam, we took out 120,000 people with us, and we later took the boat people. America has become so sour on immigrants. The email that I get, even about translators, is disgusting. As if we can spend 20 years in a country and encourage people to work with us, and one sees the loyalty of U.S. military officers to their translators. I mean, it's heartfelt. I see it on Twitter. I see it in my email. And I get email now saying, why should we let in these people? And I get it from the right and the left. And it's just such a sad testimony to both American morality and American character. We had Vietnam, and that sort of faded into the mist, and we took out eventually millions of Vietnamese. Then President Trump just abandoned overnight with a phone call our Syrian Kurdish allies who had been fighting with us in the north of Syria. And in a phone call gave President Erdogan of Turkey the green light to send his troops in. Nobody talks about this. Turkey sent troops in, killed our allies, and created 100,000 Syrian Kurdish refugees. And the special forces were furious. They weren't, who fought with the Kurds, were furious. They weren't informed. And it's a major reason why Secretary Mattis resigned as Secretary of Defense. Another black mark. And this is just so careless but it was not only careless about Afghans. We didn't give prior information to our NATO allies. And you read the stories coming out of Britain, out of Brussels. People are really furious because NATO went in with us. And the understanding is that they would come out with us. And NATO countries took a lot of casualties. And a lot of NATO countries wanted to stay in. And if there had been an insurance policy narrative, they would have stayed in. Moreover, some of those Europeans are doing more to get, and Canadians are doing more to get their translators and Afghans that they worked with out than we are. I mean, Canada, a fraction of our size, has promised to take 20,000 Afghan refugees. And we, because of concerns about political correctness, because Republicans are so against refugees, and because I think partly of the mess on the southern border, to publicly announce we're going to take 100,000 Afghans, translators, and women, and we won't leave until they are out, is not a winner politically, but I think it could be, because Americans should be loyal to our allies. And I think if President Biden stood up with SIVs, translators, and their military friends who have already, US military, of SIV translators who are already out, and said, we won't leave our friends behind. We misconstrued, but we are staying. And said that to the Taliban. The Taliban will need Western aid after we leave. It's not enough just to get Chinese and Russian help. That won't give them the humanitarian aid they need. And I think the US could set a new date and could set some order and get out our allies. Otherwise, what kind of people are we that sell out the friends that fight with us and die, and that leave our NATO allies in the lurch at a time when we have a president who stresses the need for strong alliances?
Well, Trudy, I want to give you credit here, because you just, I was about to interrupt you and ask you one of our reader questions about why the U.S. doesn't feel a moral obligation to take our in-country allies. But I think that you've answered that really well in your previous answer. So I want to give a shout out to you and a shout out to our audience member who asked that question. We do have a couple of questions coming in right now about Pakistan. So I'm going to throw those your way. So the first question is, why does the U.S. tolerate Pakistan in supporting and harboring Taliban?
This is the 64,000 billion question. For years, the United States has tried to figure out how to deal with Pakistan. Pakistan, although it has an elected government, sort of, the real power, behind the presidents and prime ministers is the military and the ISI, the intelligence service. Part of the reason that we have been stuck with Pakistan is that Afghanistan is a landlocked country, and in order to get supplies in, we had to go in through Pakistan. After 9/11 happened, then President Musharraf agreed to let the United States fly out, move troops through, So we needed Musharraf, and but Joint Chiefs of Staff leaders, one after another, have tried to deal with the ISI and the Pakistan military, have tried to persuade them, buy them, push them, and they always get lied to. I remember Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Mullen, when he left his position, he just blew up in fury because he was lied to over and over again. And you remember that Pakistan was hiding Osama bin Laden. He was living within a stone's throw of their primary military academy. And to this day, Pakistan insists that they never knew he was there, which is ludicrous. Pakistan has nuclear weapons, which is an issue. But the question has been, what do we do? I mean, President Trump cut off military aid to Pakistan. They're still doing the same thing, directing the Taliban. I wish I knew what the answer is, because if I did, I would be the most sought after analyst in the world, because so many people, analysts and experts on Pakistan who are angry at Islamabad say, oh, we should cut them out, we should sanction them, we should do this. But the basic beating heart of the Pakistani military and intelligence is hatred of India, or anger at India, or concern that India will get a foothold in Afghanistan. So when you get right down to the bottom of it, unless there's some kind of a deal between Pakistan and India in a regional peace settlement that satisfies Pakistan that India wouldn't use Afghanistan against them, and that satisfies India that Pakistan won't fund terrorists who come and bomb the Indian parliament, then poor Afghanistan gets caught in the middle, and we don't have, it seems, the tools to make them, A, tell the truth, and B, stop trying to put the Taliban in power.
So, relatedly, about our relationships with other nations, you wrote on Sunday that blood would be on Biden's hands if Afghan refugees weren't safely evacuated. And I wonder, how does this entire situation impact Biden's relationships with other nations, particularly nations like Russia and China, where you said earlier in this conversation, Biden's put a priority on trying to work with those nations?
Well, for Russia, it's Schadenfreude. I mean, Russian TV, Russian experts are just chuckling, laughing, insulting. As one of them, I was watching Andrei Kortunov, who is a very moderate Russian expert on the United States and the head of a big think tank on international affairs. He says this is just another confirmation for Russian leaders that the United States is on the decline, which President Putin believes in deeply, and you could see it in the way he played games with President Trump and manipulated him, and now it just confirms the thinking. For Russia, Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia just praised the Taliban, said they had open minds. I mean, they haven't recognized the Taliban yet, but you can see that the Russians, they've brought the Taliban to Moscow. They want a good in. Their main concerns are that the Taliban not allow Islamist terrorists to cross into Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, which are the soft underbelly of South Russia. They don't want more Islamist terrorism on their turf, but they're perfectly happy to make nice to the Taliban. China has more serious business with the Taliban. Their main concern is that the Taliban not foster Turkmen terrorists who are active in trying to attack in Xinjiang. And of course, in Xinjiang, China has concentration camps for Turkmen. So, of course, this is a problem for the Taliban. But already the Chinese foreign minister has met with one of the top Taliban leaders. I think the Taliban will be eager to keep these very small Islamist groups from crossing into Xinjiang, because they're getting a lot of benefits from the Chinese, who are building infrastructures so they can extract precious metals and copper and other goodies and oil future from Afghanistan. So China is willing to invest for its own reasons. The Taliban need it, and I think there will be good relations there. And the Chinese, I think, are also looking at this as the United States has left the field open for us as investors and expanding our Belt and Road efforts to link China with the rest of the world through Afghanistan to ports they've built in Pakistan and maybe Iran, a shorter route to export Chinese goods to the rest of the world.
So we have another audience question that I want to throw your way. And I think this ties into the idea of how did Biden botch this? This reader asks, how culpable is Secretary of State Antony Blinken in this whole mess? Noting that Biden has a really powerhouse foreign relations team, which makes this situation just even more perplexing.
It's perplexing to me because he has a very intelligent team. I mean, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, these are extremely experienced and smart people. I remember cringing a couple of months ago when Blinken was asked about getting the translators out. And he basically said, well, the Taliban are not going to be in there tomorrow. I mean, they believed mistakenly that they had time, if not 2 years, then at least 6 months. Blinken actually has been very concerned about SIVs and getting them out. But what he has failed to do is get Biden to set up a system that does an end run around all the bureaucratic and security complexities that have been set up since 9/11. Translators have been vetted over and over again for security by the military. And what organizations, veterans organizations, were proposing was evacuate them en masse to Guam or even on humanitarian parole into the United States. We did that with 7,000 Iraqis who were fighting Saddam and were about to be killed. We let them into the US on humanitarian parole. The administration did not want to do that. They thought it would look bad if they evacuated them to Guam or US shore. If some of them were found to be suspicious, then it would be hard to get them out. But they lost the ball they are, excuse my metaphors, they were lost in the trees and they didn't see the forest, which is, you could have sold this politically. These men fought with us. And the same thing with women activists. The American public would understand if you explained it. There is bipartisan support in Congress for getting the translators out. Blinken wanted to do it. The State Department was in charge of the process. The Pentagon was raring to go, but they could not do anything without a green light from the White House. And the State Department controlled the process right into the ground. Blinken put 50 more people on it in the US and a few more at the embassy. But that was not sufficient to handle the huge numbers. Even if we had had several months more, they should have made a presidential decision and gotten them out. But they didn't want to go that route.
I want to pivot now to a different reader question, an audience question. You mentioned earlier that Biden had a lot of priorities when he got into the White House. Vaccination high among them, economic recovery from COVID is high among them. And I wonder, and a reader asks, how does this collapse impact Biden's ambitious domestic agenda? The reader notes that she felt that, or he or she felt that his domestic agenda was comparable in scope to FDR or LBJ. Does this Afghanistan situation throw a large wrench into that?
I think it's too early to say, and it depends on what plays out in the next few weeks and how hypocritical the GOP decides to be about this. I mean, when Biden first made the announcement about pulling out, Mitch McConnell, the the ranking Republican in the Senate, supported the decision because President Trump had wanted to get out. President Trump set a May 31st deadline to get out. And earlier, at the end of his term, he tried to set a 6-week deadline to get out. In October, he said we should be out by Christmas, which would have left no time for getting anyone out except the troops. So the Republicans now are trying to say, and I understand why, because there's a debacle playing out on TV, that this is all Biden. And it is a deep error. But, it depends on how this plays out politically. If you look back at polls, the American public has not had Afghanistan on the forefront. It depends on how you ask the question in polling, but Americans were just not focused on it. It was way, way down the list of American concerns at the beginning of the Biden administration. It's in the forefront now because people are seeing pictures of babies being thrown over barbed wire fences to Marines, which reminds people of what was happening when Jews were being taken to Auschwitz and were throwing the babies over wire to anybody who would catch them. So these shots are horrifying and they resonate. Whether Biden can get more people out, whether this political issue catches on, and whether some of the GOP are trying to make it an immigration issue. How can you even think of taking all these dirty Afghans? Well, I'm sorry, these are human beings like us. These are good people, educated people, people who believed in us. We can't take every Afghan, but the ones that are being lobbied for by women's groups, by veterans groups, are people who speak English, who are hardworking, who many of them have relatives here. These are the kind of immigrants that would make America better. And the idea that you have some conservatives casting these dirty aspersions at them is sickening. So I think it depends on how Biden handles this, whether he extends the deadline, whether he gets more people out, and whether the issue sticks with independents who are on the fence about Biden. I mean, probably, Democrats will forgive him because, who else are they going to vote for? But how this would play out, say, in congressional elections, I don't know. I don't know if it'll have an impact. I think it will have a global impact on America's reputation overseas, which made a comeback under Biden because it was in tatters after President Trump. And this will have, I think, a very sobering impact. We already see it in Britain and with NATO leaders.
Okay, so we have time for just 2 more short questions before we need to wrap up. But before we do, I'm curious about your prediction. I want you to predict the future a bit. For the future of Afghanistan, we know that Americans will exit and some people are going to get out and many won't get out. But what happens next for the people there? Do we as Americans just sort of watch as the Taliban takes over again? Or do you expect that America is going to find ourselves entangled again very quickly?
Obviously, I'm going to start with this is very hard to predict, and it depends on what the Taliban do. The Taliban leaders in Kabul, the ones who were, quote, negotiating in Qatar, in Doha, with the Trump administration, they're talking a good game. We want a stable country. We're going to let women get educated. We're going to let women work. So far on the ground, there have been no signs of that. And you already have instances around the country where there are lists and people are being pulled out, beaten, or killed because they worked with Americans, because they were translators, because they were human rights activists. One wonderful human rights activist with many Philadelphia connections who just got out to Germany. Taliban came to her house in Herat in Western Afghanistan. They beat up her guards at the house she was in hiding in Kabul and asked for her by name. There are different factions of Taliban, so we don't know whether the putative leaders of the Taliban control the whole country. We don't know whether there will be growing resistance from former militia leaders who didn't fight back yet, and whether there'll be a lot of bloodshed. We don't know what game Pakistan wants to play with its Taliban friends. So it's very hard to know how the country's going to go. Will the Taliban let TV presenters, women, keep working? Will it let women in bureaucracy keep working? You know, if the Taliban wanted to play a smart game, they could, but we don't know if that's going to happen. Until we know, the Taliban is now cut off from international aid funds, IMF, other loan agencies, humanitarian agencies have mainly left. UN workers are being threatened. The Taliban is going to be in terrible economic trouble because the government, the society, the bureaucracy has basically collapsed. People are going to have trouble getting food. Their economy was already in dire shape, and it was living off of aid money and military aid money from the US and the West. Not huge amounts, but enough to keep the government going. What's going to keep the government going? Will the Taliban play nice because they need that money? Will they keep playing nice if they get it? I mean, these are all the questions that will play out. Will we be able to get reporting if they become vicious all around the country? This time, yes, I think because so many young people who never lived under the Taliban, who now are social media savvy, I think like Iran, they will get the word out. And the question is whether the Taliban, as in Iran, will arrest them en masse, beat them, slaughter them. So there are all these ifs. And the biggest if is for the United States, the Taliban has been fighting alongside major Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda supporter groups, including the Haqqani network. If that continues in total violation of this surrender document that the Taliban got from President Trump, then what will the US do? Because it is much harder to fight terrorist groups from several hours away if you don't have anyone on the ground, and the Afghan army and the Afghan commando forces are now kaput, and if you don't have US intelligence on the ground and US special forces and US planes on the ground. So, it's a chain of ifs. I think the last thing this administration wants is to go back in. It would be extremely difficult to go back in. And even sending commandos in now is very difficult because the country is landlocked and we don't have bases anywhere close by. It's just away on the Gulf.
So we have about, thank you, Trudy. We have about 90 seconds left before our hour ends. So before we go, I do want to make sure that we ask this very important question, which is what can we be doing to help Afghan refugees from Philadelphia? And, if you could sum that up in about a minute, that'd be great.
Right. There are a lot of local organizations like HIAS, Philadelphia, and others who are standing by ready to help those people who get out, and other organizations who are helping veterans. I am going to list them on my next column, on my Sunday column, and you can also see the list. Erica, can you tell them where they can see the list on the Inquirer website?
I believe we'll link it on this page, this inquirer.com/Trudy Live. We'll link it right there so that you have easy access to all of the organizations.
And I urge you to, there are a lot of volunteer opportunities. There will be SIV translators who do get out and will be coming here. And I will be continuing to put information either in or below my column, but check on this page where you're watching for a very good Inquirer story with a lot of links.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to all of our viewers. That's all the time we have. Trudy, thank you for sharing your experience. And I hope that all of our viewers enjoyed this program. And if so, please share the link, inquirer.com/TrudyLive. And for more coverage like this, please visit inquirer.com/opinion, where we're sharing analysis and commentary on news events 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Thanks very much and have a great day.